Imagine walking into a courtroom, expecting fairness, only to be humiliated in front of everyone because of your age and the color of your skin. What happens next will leave you speechless. Before we start, hit that subscribe button because this story will make you believe in karma and justice like never before. It all began on a crisp Monday morning in downtown Atlanta, Georgia, where the marble pillars of the courthouse gleamed under the southern sun, a symbol of justice for some and despair for others. 68-year-old Evelyn Carter adjusted her floral dress and clutched her worn leather purse close to her chest as she walked through the heavy oak doors. Her hands trembled slightly, not because she was afraid of losing her case. She had seen worse storms in her life, but because of the stares, the whispers, and that gnawing feeling of being judged for simply existing. Evelyn wasn't just any grandma. She was a retired law professor, a woman who had spent decades shaping the very legal system people now took for granted. But nobody in that courtroom knew her past. They only saw a fragile black woman with gray curls pinned neatly beneath her church hat. She was there fighting for her late husband's land, a modest piece of property their family had owned for generations, now threatened by a greedy developer who claimed technical violations in the original deed. And representing the developer was Nathan Whitaker, a 30-something hotshot attorney with slicked back hair, a $1,000 suit, and a tongue sharp enough to slice through steel. From the moment Evelyn saw him strutting into the courtroom like he owned it, she knew this wouldn't be easy. Nathan loved the spotlight. He thrived on humiliation, and when he saw Evelyn, his smirk widened like a predator spotting an easy kill. The case began, and within minutes, Nathan launched his verbal assault, mocking Evelyn for representing herself. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "this isn't bingo night. This is a courtroom. Are you sure you're in the right place?" Laughter rippled through the room. Even the bailiff chuckled under his breath. Evelyn simply smiled faintly and whispered to herself, "Lord, give me strength." Nathan pulled out a stack of papers and waved them theatrically. "Your Honor, the law is crystal clear here," he declared, his voice booming like a Broadway performer. "According to Section 14B of the Property Ownership Act, her claim is invalid. She's clinging to old papers that have no legal standing." He tossed a condescending glance toward Evelyn, his hazel eyes sparkling with arrogance. But what Nathan didn't know, what nobody in that courtroom knew, was that Evelyn Carter had helped draft Section 14B 30 years ago when she served as a legal consultant for the state legislature. The very law Nathan was quoting was partly her creation. And in that moment, as Nathan continued to flaunt his confidence, Evelyn's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. This wasn't just a fight for land anymore. This was personal. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Nathan strutted back to his table like a victorious peacock, while Evelyn adjusted her glasses and slowly stood up, her calm demeanor masking the storm brewing inside. "Your Honor," she began softly, her southern accent warm yet commanding respect, "I appreciate Mr. Whitaker's interpretation of Section 14B, but I believe the law is more nuanced than that." Nathan snorted loudly, cutting her off. "With all due respect, ma'am, I think I know the law better than someone who probably learned it from TV shows." The audience erupted in laughter again, and Nathan basked in their amusement like a comedian soaking in applause. But then Evelyn walked to the podium, pulled out a thick binder, and flipped it open to a page with handwritten notes. "You quoted subsection C incorrectly, counselor," she said firmly, her voice suddenly sharp as steel. The room went silent. Nathan blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" Evelyn raised her head, her eyes locking with his. "You heard me. Subsection C does not apply to pre-1985 deeds, and this property was registered in 1978. Therefore, the clause you cited is irrelevant." Nathan's jaw tightened. He stammered, That's not possible. That section clearly states." Evelyn cut him off with the precision of a surgeon. I should know. I wrote it. Gasps filled the room like a sudden gust of wind. Slamming open a door. Nathan's face drained of color as whispers spread like wildfire. The judge leaned forward, eyebrows arched. You wrote it? Evelyn nodded calmly. Yes, Your Honor. I served on the legislative committee that drafted the Property Ownership Act of 1984. My signature is on the original bill. She pulled out a yellowed document with elegant cursive handwriting at the bottom her name. Evelyn J. Carter. The courtroom exploded in murmurs. Nathan's hands shook as he fumbled with his papers. His confidence evaporated like water in the desert. But Evelyn wasn't done. She looked him dead in the eye and said, "The law is not a weapon to mock people with, young man. It's a shield to protect those who can't fight for themselves. You'd do well to remember that." The judge slammed the gavel for order. But everyone could feel the tide turning. Nathan had no idea this sweet-looking grandma was about to dismantle him piece by piece. The air in the courtroom grew heavy as Eleanor Jackson's revelation lingered, and though Richard Carlisle tried desperately to restore his swagger, his voice cracked under the weight of her truth, his once confident arguments now sounding forced, even childish against the measured dignity of the woman he had mocked. The jury no longer looked at him with admiration, but with skepticism, their eyes drawn instead to Eleanor, who sat like a quiet monument to battles most of them had only read about in history books, and as she adjusted her glasses and began to recount her role, the tension in the room shifted entirely. This was no longer a case about a helpless grandmother being cornered by a slick attorney, but a reckoning with history itself. She described nights when she and her colleagues argued line by line over the exact language of anti-discrimination protections, how powerful lobbyists tried to weaken them, how entire communities depended on voices like hers to make sure the laws had teeth, and as she spoke, her words were not just testimony, they were living memory, woven into the very fabric of the statutes Carlisle had tried to twist. The jurors leaned forward, captivated. Even the judge, who had presided over countless trials, found himself listening with an almost reverent stillness. Richard, meanwhile, fumbled, objecting half-heartedly, his face flushed with the realization that his arrogance had not only backfired, but had exposed his ignorance before the entire court. At one point, in a desperate attempt to regain control, he sneered, "So you expect us to believe a woman like you shaped the law of this nation?" But the words sounded venomous, and the audience hissed softly at the insult, forcing the judge to glare him into silence. Eleanor, unshaken, replied, "Not only do I expect you to believe it, Counselor, I expect you to respect it," her tone so firm that it cut deeper than any insult Richard had thrown her way. She then opened a worn leather notebook she had carried, its pages yellowed with age, and revealed handwritten notes, original drafts, and signatures of the very committee that had birthed the statute. The courtroom gasped again, and Carlisle's face drained of color. The judge examined the notebook with care, his eyes widening, then looked back at Eleanor with genuine respect, as though seeing not just a witness but a guardian of justice itself. Richard's confidence crumbled entirely as his own words began to betray him. Every clause he cited had a counterpoint Eleanor herself had written decades ago, and with each rebuttal she delivered, he sank deeper into humiliation. The jurors whispered among themselves, clearly moved, and even the opposing counsel sat in stunned silence, realizing they were watching history dismantle arrogance before their very eyes. Eleanor's granddaughter, sitting quietly behind her, wiped a tear, overwhelmed with pride, for her grandmother had not only endured mockery, but had risen above it to remind everyone in that chamber that laws are not cold words in dusty books. They are born of sweat, sacrifice, and courage. And as Chapter 3 closed, the once dominant Richard Carlisle now looked like a boy lost in his own arguments, dwarfed by the presence of a woman he had underestimated, while the entire courtroom leaned toward the inevitable truth. Eleanor Jackson was not merely defending herself, she was putting arrogance itself on trial, The silence in the courtroom was absolute when the final day arrived. A silence so thick it carried the weight of decades of struggle, sacrifice, and truth. And as Eleanor Jackson rose to speak once more, her frail frame seemed to swell with the strength of every battle she had ever fought. Her voice, though soft, cut through the air sharper than any gavel. "Laws are not toys for the powerful to twist," she declared, her eyes locking onto Richard Carlyle, whose once arrogant posture had withered into a slouch of shame. "They are promises written in the blood, sweat, and hope of people who refuse to be silenced." Her words struck the jury with the force of revelation, reminding them that this case was no longer about one grandmother's dignity, but about whether justice itself could be mocked without consequence. Carlyle attempted one last desperate argument, flinging legal jargon like broken weapons, but his words echoed hollow in the chamber, now filled with the living embodiment of the law itself, Eleanor Jackson, the woman he had laughed at, the woman he had belittled, the woman who had written the very statute he had built his career upon. The judge's gavel came down hard, silencing Richard mid-sentence, and in that moment it was clear. The tide had turned beyond repair. The jury returned swiftly, their verdict unanimous, and as the foreman announced their decision in Eleanor's favor, the room erupted with applause, not the raucous clapping of theater, but the thunderous gratitude of a people witnessing arrogance humbled by truth. Richard's face collapsed into defeat, his eyes darting about for sympathy, but finding none, while Eleanor's granddaughter rushed to her side, tears streaming, whispering, "Grandma, you did it. You showed them who you are." Eleanor smiled, gently brushing her hand across her granddaughter's cheek, and replied, "I didn't do this just for me, child. I did it so you'll never let anyone make you feel small when you are standing on the shoulders of giants." The judge, visibly moved, rose from his bench and spoke words rarely heard in any court. "Mrs. Jackson, this courtroom owes you gratitude, not just for your testimony, but for your service to justice itself." Eleanor nodded humbly, her dignity shining brighter than any robe, any title, any polished argument that had ever crossed those floors. Richard gathered his papers with trembling hands, his arrogance shattered, his career effectively ended, not by force or fury, but by the quiet, immovable truth of a grandmother's legacy. As Eleanor stepped out of the courtroom, supported by her granddaughter yet walking taller than she had in years, the crowd stood in respect, not for a witness, but for a woman who had proven that the law is not merely a weapon for the clever, but a shield for the just. And with the doors closing behind her, the story reached its powerful end. Arrogance mocked her, but history remembered her, and in that remembrance she had already won.